Most people are not equipped to understand the seemingly endless facets of an HOA. That's why we're here, to help you become uncommonly prepared to serve your HOA. Whether you're a board member or a manager, join us in the Uncommon Area.
Welcome to the Uncommon Area. I am Matthew Holbrook, and this episode is all about reserve studies. This is a good episode that provides an introduction to reserve studies and how to think about putting together a good reserve study. And joining me in this episode is Mark Smith of Advanced Reserve Solutions, and we have a very good conversation around reserve studies and the different components to be thinking about in making sure that you get a good reserve study for your homeowners association. So I hope you watch and that this episode is really beneficial to you. All right, well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We're talking about reserve studies, and I think maybe the best way to start is for somebody who's new to a board of directors, for example, how would you explain what a reserve study is and why it's important?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Most of the time when it comes to having a reserve study, reserve study is a financial plan for the association. It's very meaningful when it comes to scheduling and what the potential price could be for each item that comes up that the expenses needed for. And then with a actual reserve study itself, it's super crucial because it's basically financial plan. Like imagine yourself trying to budget for something with no plan. If you had no plan to budget for painting or no money, where are you going to get that money from? Well, you're going to have to borrow it from someone, pay it back through a loan, through friends, family, but this case, it's a higher scale. You're talking about tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And where's that money going to come from? You're probably going to have to either A, special assess it, or it's going to have to come through a loan, which you're going to have to pay back anyway. So it's very crucial. So
your point is if an association has an effective reserve study and builds that into their budget, then they're going to be able to fund their reserves adequately so that when those expenses come up, they're not going to have to do special assessments or loans.
Yeah, absolutely. An adequate reserve study that is properly followed, it can lead you to such a successful, beautiful community that will help you in the long run with not only holding the property's values, but also, maybe even raising the property values.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah. So let's break that down a little bit further. When we say reserve study, I still want to define that for somebody who maybe is coming to this new.
Yeah.
What are the components of a reserve study? What's included?
Yeah, so typically a reserve study is everything that an association or entity maintains, what they're responsible for. And every association is different. Some of them have single-family homes. Some of them have condos. The CC&Rs reads totally different for each one of these entities. Condo communities, they're responsible for the exterior of the buildings, whereas single-family homes, they're not. So the association needs to come up with funds to paint the exteriors. So or even re-roofing the exteriors. So, looking at these type of these breakdowns will help you to build a reserve study based on what the CC&Rs read, and then you can come up with an appropriate plan and each one of these items become broken down into the reserve study. Painting stucco, painting wood, replacing utility doors, renovating the streets, seal coating the streets. All these items are components into a reserve study and accumulate all together and basically come up with a funding plan for the association's financial future.
So you're talking about the different components that an association maintains. We'll usually refer to those as the assets of the association. Right. So you're detailing out in a reserve study every asset and breaking it down, even separating painting stucco versus painting wood. You're breaking it down into every asset, and then you're determining a useful life of that asset.
Absolutely.
And what it's going to cost to address that, whether it be repainting, re-roofing, resealing, whatever it is,
right.
And then making sure you're putting away money so that you have that much money when you need it, when the time comes.
Yeah. there's associations from anywhere between 2-3 units to hundreds of units, right? And each one
thousands of units.
Yeah, thousands. High rises, mid rises, single family homes, small condos, townhomes. All this stuff. It adds up. And some of them have all wood, where wood costs more to paint, wood costs more to replace. Stucco is, a pretty. It could be a substantial cost itself, but wood we've seen in the past couple of years has come up price-wise dramatically, even replacing the woods. Raw materials went up 8.5% last year, whereas 15% was just labor.
So you have to build all of those things into your cost projections when you're developing that plan in the reserve study.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be tedious here and there, but I've obviously been in the industry enough to understand where prices need to be adjusted according to what's been increased in price within the past year or so.
Yeah. So as a reserve analyst, one of the pieces of this, it sounds like it would be that you would need to read through an association's CC&Rs before you start preparing the reserve study. Would that be a fair understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. The associations that are newly built come up, the builders have what's called a DRE budget. And their DRE budget does lay out some of the association's maintenance responsibilities, but not all of it is always listed. So looking at the CC&Rs is really the bare bones, or your blueprint to what the reserve study should have on it. Yeah. Because if the DRE budget's reading something different, I've had associations to where condos didn't have utility doors listed on the DRE budget, but it said clearly on the CC&Rs that they were responsible for it.
Right.
And, that's a cost they have to make up for, especially if they're going off the DRE budget when it comes to reserve allocation annually.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that, I think, but that is a common issue, I know, for associations where there are assets that they are not including in their initial reserve studies, and then later those expenses come up and they've got to figure out how to address those.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the legal requirements for a reserve study. How frequently does an association have to have a reserve study? What are the different types of reserve studies that can be done, and how does that all fit in from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, for sure. So the civil code requires that an association needs to have a physical on-site inspection every 3 years. Every 3 years, a person like myself, reserve designee, needs to come out to the association and physically inspect every component that the association is responsible for.
And the purpose of that physical inspection is what?
It's basically to look at it's for the homeowners, right? And the idea is that you want to make sure that things that are being decayed or that need things to be replaced or painted now needs to be updated in the reserve study if it's not already. So if something says remaining life of 1, that next year it needs to be painted, but I'm out there and I see that it needs to be painted now, then I'll reflect that saying, hey, you guys need to paint the wrought iron fencing, it's chipping. So the idea is to keep up on the maintenance so that you can uphold the integrity and the aesthetics of the community. You don't want it to fall at the wayside.
Yeah. And does it work exactly the opposite as well? If you went out and the reserve study says you're supposed to paint in a year and you look at it and you're like, this probably doesn't need to be repainted for another 3 years. Would you adjust the reserve study that way?
Yeah, absolutely. That does happen where some associations don't get hit with too much sun. And maybe even not only will I push out the remaining life, but maybe I'll maybe even push out the useful life to a certain thing that certain year that makes sense, whereas maybe I had painting every of the woodwork and trim every 4 years. Maybe we should do it every 5 years instead. Every reserve study can be adjusted every year accordingly, especially if the association has a history of it. If an association has a history of painting every 5 years because it has looked good on the 4th year and the 5 year they're starting to look a little faded, then yeah, absolutely, for the woodwork and trim to paint.
All right, so you just made a distinction between remaining life and useful life.
Yeah.
What are the differences between those two terms?
Yeah, so useful life is how long we predict a component will last for. So an example would be like a water heater. We predict that a typical water heater will last for like a pool area, will last about 10 years, right? Now, a remaining life is what I will predict that water heater how much years it has left on its ticker. Right. So if I think it looks really old, but it's still limping along, I may adjust it to where it said 5 years, but now it looks like it might be 1 year left until it needs to be replaced.
So you could have the useful life of a pool filter might be 10 years, but you're 5 years into it. So you have a 5-year remaining life, but you look at it and you say, really, it maybe only has a 3-year remaining life.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them are left out in the sun where they're not even covered at all. So the exterior part of the filter will be more corroded looking than it would have looked like if it were indoors, and it would have been stayed the 5 years.
Yeah. So going back to the legal requirements, there's a legal requirement to do an on-site visual inspection as a part of the reserve study every 3 years. Mm-hmm. Are there any other legal requirements that a board should be aware of?
Legal requirements when it comes to reserve studies, no. In between years, there is no requirement to that sense. But what I will say is that in those in-between years, you could easily fall at the wayside when it comes to trying to catch back up if you're only doing it every 3 years. So, for example, let's say you do the reserve study on year 1, but then you don't do one year 2 or 3, then that means if the average of the inflation was 3% for those 2 years that you missed, then you're making up for 6%. And then the third year you come back, you need to not special assess, but you need to make up for those years of increased inflation. And given for a year that was very unpredictable, last year of a inflation rate of about 15%, you're looking almost about 20%. You're behind now into catching up for your allocations to raise assessments to get back to where you need to be.
Yeah. So when you are going to prepare a reserve study and an association has contracted with you to do that, what are some of the clues that you get from either management or the board where you think, okay, we're gonna get a really good reserve study out of this? They seem to know what they're doing, and you can only do as good of a reserve study as the information that you're given. So what are the clues that tell you that this is going to work out well?
Usually it's from the get-go. When some boards will meet me out there, and I'll right away have a list of questions for them, because I've done my research. I've looked at their CC&Rs. I've looked at their DRE budget, and I'll ask them questions on, okay, hey, your CC&Rs read that you guys are responsible for the exterior parts of the garage doors. What does that mean? Are you talking about the repair and replacement of the exterior garage doors, or are you talking about just painting it? So, I'll have a list of questions for every association of what they're wanting to do and what the plan is, because every association has a different plan. Whether they want to push things out, or if they want to phase a roofing project out, or if they want to have a landscaping amount of money that they want to set annually through reserves so they can keep the integrity and overall look of the community nice and beautiful.
Yeah. What would make a reserve study not turn out well? There would be an ineffective or unhelpful reserve study.
So one of the ways is that some associations will provide me with financial information, and they'll just give me their financials, and they won't give me what they've done throughout the year at all. And it's very hard for me to pick out through their financials what they've actually done. It'll say pool area X amount. It'll say concrete X amount. Okay, what did you do to the pool area? What kind of work did you do to the concrete? A lot of these things are very generalized to where they're just categories. And when I look at these financials, they're just jargon to me. And I know that they have a general ledger that probably knows every bit of what was spent on each category. But the easiest part is when a manager comes to me and fills out one of our update worksheets, and it just shows shows a list of what they've done. Replacing pool furniture. Okay, that's what they did at the pool area. Got it. Replace the mastic around the pool. Okay, easy. Things like these help me create a more effective reserve study, because all these items I have listed in the reserve study. So instead of giving me a lump sum of what they spent and not tell me what they did is very difficult for me, because not only does it waste time for me, but I'm now wasting time for the managers, board members, to get them the effective reserve study that they need so they can meet their budget.
So when when a board or a manager comes to you to start a reserve study, the more information they have regarding what they have spent and exactly on what components they have spent it on, the more they have that information for you, and the more detailed that is, the better reserve study you're going to be able to produce.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I tell associations all the time that if you have a cost that differs from mine, share it with me, because these past few years, a lot of vendors have been spiking up their costs just because labor and raw materials, and it's almost gone up almost double what it was a few years ago. So it's hard to try to get where a lot of price points are at. So if an association has a proposal or bids that they received and they want to go with a particular type of company, then please share me the bid. So I'll take that cost and I'll implement it into the reserve study so that now we're all on the same page.
So you're saying both looking forward and backwards, that information. So if an association comes to you and they can give you details on, this is the money we have spent so far this year on these components, and this is exactly what we did, that's helpful. But it's also helpful if they have proposals for other assets that maybe they have not yet addressed, but they have the proposals in hand.
Right.
They give that to you. Now you're working off of real numbers and real information.
Yeah, it goes to the very point of, now we're down to the very cent of what you're gonna spend and what you have spent, and so that some associations have roofing phase projects that are 3 years, and each year they do 1/3 of the community. On the third year they're done, but they have a specific cost of what they're spending every year. Yeah. Maybe it's not, maybe they have 12 buildings, but they're doing 4, 3, and then they do the last bunch at the very end. So the numbers may be different, but at least we know what the cost is per year.
Yeah. You had mentioned going out and doing visual inspections and kind of assessing the remaining life of particular components. What is that whole process like to be able to determine what's the remaining life of? You could be looking at hundreds of components, how do you determine what the remaining life is on each one of them?
Yeah, it's with me being inside the industry for so long, I've been taught and I've seen firsthand how things deteriorate over time. So I've been doing reserve studies now for almost 15 years. So, given that painting woodwork is on usually a 4 or 5 year cycle, I've seen what it looks when it's first painted, and I've seen what it looks like when it needs to be painted, right? So when I go out to an association, I'll look at the painting, and I was at one today, and the stucco was fading on a lot of the units. You could clearly see that there was like watermarks coming down the sides of it, and sometimes that does happen, but these ones were clearly faded. They were once painted, stucco was painted black, and now they're gray. And some of them were bright, dark orange, but now they're a light orange. So those are tells right there. But also when it comes to woodwork, if you see the paint chipping, that's a clear sign. If you see the wood like well faded, and it's usually because the sun's just hitting it directly, right? Wrought iron is evident when it comes to, you'll see speckles of either chipped paint or rusted out areas because the sprinklers are hitting it, and you need to paint. Because if you don't keep up on these items, then you're in more of a whirlwind of hurt, because if you don't keep up on the woodwork painting, then you may be into a bigger issue of wood rot, and you need to replace the wood rot. And hey, we never allocated money to replace any wood. So now where's that coming from, right? And same thing with if you don't keep up on the painting of the wrought iron, you could extend the remaining life of the wrought iron if you keep up on the maintenance or anything else, And that's really what my job is to help the associations to keep up on the maintenance. Because if they don't keep up on the maintenance, then they're going to be in bigger issues.
Yeah, but when you're out and you're looking at components or you're looking at the data that you have, how do you what is the number that you put down for a component that has this much useful life left?
Yeah, so every component is different. So like I have a standard, and my bosses have told me standards of what every component has as for useful lives. So everything's just different. When it comes to tile roofing, that's a 30-year replacement cost. When it comes to comp shingle roofing, that's about 20, 25 years. Flat roofs, 15.
So you're working off of kind of just standardized metrics that for each component.
Yeah, it's kind of imprinted in my brain now. I've been doing it for so long that I know when things need to be painted, when things need to be replaced, and it's regurgitative and for every association.
So when you're starting with those numbers, and then you do a visual inspection, and you're kind of comparing the visual inspection to what based on the metrics should be the remaining life, and then you're making just an estimated adjustment to that based on what you see.
Yeah, so when I go out to the community, I'll look at let's say like a wrought iron painting needs to be done, right? And so for me, wrought iron painting is done on a 3-4 year cycle, right? And if it needs to be done now, then the replacement of the wrought iron railing or fencing will be in conjunction of it, right? So if it says 20 years left on it, I will have it divisible by 3, so I'll have it as a remaining life of 21, so that every time the painting cycle goes through, it meets up with the 21st year, and hey, it's the 21st year, we're just replacing it now. So you keep things in conjunction with each other. Yeah.
Well, when you're looking at things over a long period of time like that, how do you factor in inflation? What rates do you use for inflation? How do you know what to plug in?
Yeah, it's a moving target every year. We try to do the best that we can to predict the future. Can anyone predict the future? No. But we do the best that we can. And the way we did it last year, midway through, is that we took the 30-year average, and it was a little less than 2.5% at the time. Now, near the end of the year, it kind of shot up to, like I mentioned, 15% for labor, 8.5% for raw materials. So we jumped up to 3%. And now these 2.5%, 3% I'm talking about is what we use as a global parameter inside of our program, so that every year each current cost jumps up that 3%. The inflation cost for for like a water heater is $1,000 that we had for year one. 3%, it's going to grow 3% from then on. And then every year it just keeps growing.
Now, does that throw you off on different useful lives or remaining life of a component? So let's say you have a significant component that's going to be replaced in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And then you have a roof that's going to be replaced in 30 years. Well, your 2.5%, 3% inflation rate might be appropriate 30 years from now for that roof, but for that component that's going to be replaced in 2 years, inflation might be running 5% or 6%, now all of a sudden you have under reserved for that component.
Yeah, and it's just like I said, it's a moving target, and we do the best that we can to anticipate inflation, but it's so hard. Like who anticipated that last year was going to jump up 15%? Nobody could have guessed that. So I have associations trying to combat it. They're trying to adjust, doing a moving average of the first couple years. They keep it at 5%. But if you start doing that, then you're shooting up your reserve allocation even more, and it's going to make things a little bit more haywire when it comes to raising assessments. So it's a give and a take. It's hard.
So as you look at how reserve studies have changed, you've been doing this for a long time. What do you see going forward? How will the process of doing reserve studies and how will reserve studies themselves change with technology or just the development of where we are in the world? What do you expect?
I think a lot more alterations are going to come. So, we're all well aware of what happened inside Florida, the Surfside tower, and a lot of things are being implemented more so these days. Now, it used to be that reserve studies would read anything that was of the naked eye or had a predictable, useful life would usually go inside a reserve study. But ever since Surfside happened, the reserve study standards has changed. Now, what I mean by that is that some of the reserve study can be added some things inside there, such as things behind walls, the structure of a building. Whereas before, we wouldn't look behind walls or the structure of buildings. We would leave it as unfunded because most of those things would last the lifetime of a community, and nor was it predictable. But now things are going to be added to where it may not be predictable, but we want to make sure that it's structurally sound, right? And that kind of goes along with what we've seen with what happened inside San Diego with the balconies giving out on a bunch of kids that were on there, and I think a few of them had passed away. So, the SB 326 inspection has now been passed so that a lot of associations need to have their balconies inspected on a 9-year cycle, so that those are structurally sound, so the same thing doesn't happen again. Yeah. So these things are starting to be implemented more and more, and I think it's just going to only get farther with that.
Are the results of those inspections then incorporated into your reserve studies as you go forward?
Yeah, they have been. So from our standpoint, not only are we trying to anticipate for the cost of inspection, because the inspection, it guarantees that 95% of the balconies need to be inspected that are 6 feet or higher, 3 dwelling units or more. And a lot of these are just need to be inspected and drilled into so they can see the wood planks inside to see how well they're holding up. So we anticipate for the cost of the inspection, but also we add a little fluff behind that for any repair costs. And some of that goes along with resurfacing the actual decks, which we have been implementing for years already, and top coating the decks. So it kind of rolls in with each other. But yeah, I mean, the deck inspections can be pretty lengthy and pretty costly.
Yeah. Well, Mark, this has all been really helpful, a good introduction into thinking through reserve studies. Anything that you really wish that board members or managers knew about reserve studies?
Yeah, I mean, reserve studies are a financial tool, right? And the idea behind that is for you to follow the plan, right? And, maybe the plan may differentiate from what you're trying to do when it comes to repair, replacing, or painting. But as long as you have a sense of what's upcoming and what needs to be done for your community, so that you can, further the community's health, not only financially, but also, curb appeal. Curb appeal is one of the biggest things these days. And for you to roll into a community and to check out a home that's for sale, are you really going to want to buy a home that the front area wasn't really that well maintained, the monument sign's falling apart? It's going to turn you away a little bit. So the idea is to stay up on the maintenance so that you can, have a better curb appeal for your home in general.
Yeah. And the reserve study is a big component to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it. And I hope that episode is helpful for you. And I would encourage you to look for other episodes on the Uncommon Area.